Well, if it isn't one thing, it's another. But it's Shabbat, right? We are blessed to be here again. I had started a video and it got interrupted, so I'm just starting it all over again. Um, blessings on this Shabbat for all who are watching and will watch. We thank coming in and and from Ethiopia and from India that are watching. Um, and so we are blessed.
I'm trying to send the link.
Hannah sending the link to everybody. Just a minute while we try to set this thing up. We thank you for your patience. Thank you for being understanding. One of our sisters was stranded, so we went to go and help her.
Got it.
Um, but I'm going to start. Last week we talked about the flood, and that there were um, there were two stories of the flood, at least two stories of the flood. But the flood is a very it prevails in all cultures. Gilgamesh talks about a man who went up and after the flood, who went up and oh yeah, that's we'll get to that in a minute. Shalom, and Andre, blessings to you. And so after the flood, we have Noah. Um, and one of the things that has to be said is um, in in the scripture text, we see the Kenites. We see the Kenites present, and we know that the Kenites are the descendants of Cain. And so, how is it that if the flood was all over the world, how is it that the Kenites, the children of Cain, were able to survive the flood? And that's a good question, um, because geology has proven that it wasn't worldwide. It was more, in the Middle East area. And so the Kenites apparently were not in the Middle East. They were not what in Canaan and in Mesopotamia and all of those places. They were in a different place, and so that's something that we have to take into consideration, that they passed the flood. But what the stories afterwards seem to prove to us is that um, the people, the children of Noah, you know, we have to understand that when the authors of the scriptures are talking about the whole world, they've never seen the whole world. They've never seen the whole world. They've only seen the Middle East area, and so that Middle East area is the world to them. Okay, and so when they're naming places in the Middle East. And when we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about Turkey. We're talking about from all the way from west in Turkey and maybe Cyprus, Corinthia, all the way into past Jordan towards Persia and Iran. And so when they're talking about the world, they're not really talking about the whole world. They're talking about the Middle East. And so that flood was in the world for them, but we understand that they were talking about the Middle East. And so, or a majority of the Middle East. And so afterwards, there's the story of Nimrod. Now, Nimrod is a descendant of Cain. And what we've tried to rationalize when it comes to the children of Noah, Christianity has said, oh, well, from Noah, all the peoples in the world were born. I don't think so. Um, Again, we're talking about the Middle East. All the people of the Middle East were born. Um, but for the rest of the world, that can't be proven yet. So we'll wait on that. Um, but Nimrod comes as the grandson or the great grandson of Noah. Now, when we read the text about Nimrod in Genesis chapter 10, it's talking about that Nimrod was a mighty hunter, but he was a mighty hunter. In the Hebrew, it says that he opposed Yahweh. And so he brought about all of the idolatrous practices that we see nowadays, the worshiping of idols. The reason why it's so difficult to get out of Christianity, because left and right, you see paganism, you see idolatry in every part of Christianity and Judaism and Islam. So people are going to be upset with me saying that, but that's okay. I'll still be alive. Um, but most of those customs come from Nimrod. Nimrod is the one where we have the naming of the days, and we know that uh, Nimrod was a sun worshiper. According to a lot of historical research, when you look up Nimrod and his kingdom. He was very pervasive in teaching the people idolatry and to worship the stars. And so that's the reason why we have Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, because it's named after the stars, which they considered gods. And so, and then we have the Tower of Babel, where the languages are divided. So the languages were divided and we don't know when. Scientists don't know exactly when it may have happened, but you can imagine if there are not that many people on the earth, they had to have been speaking the same language. But the more you start to separate and divide, the more you get languages. Take the United States for instance. There's a Southern accent. There's a West Coast accent. There's an East Coast accent. There's a Texas accent. There's a Middle Eastern accent because language changes with distance. And so when people start to, break apart, Acadia, what's Acadia, Andre? Oh, like Scorpion King, Acadia. There was a place called Acadia. As a matter of fact, it's mentioned in that text, if I do say so. Yeah, so when it comes to, there has been research. There's been research that says that Hebrew is a dialect of the Proto-Canaanite language. The Proto-Canaanite language is Paleo Hebrew, and it was the ancient form. It's not that Hebrew is original. It's just that the Canaanites, we'll have to get to that a little later. We need to kind of go in order, right? And so with the Hebrew language, though, in linguistics, it's said to have come from the Proto-Canaanite language. And the same with Aramaic and Arabic. Right. So that's worth mentioning. The division of languages. And so when we go a little bit further in Genesis chapter 11, we are going to Genesis chapter, going back, and we're going to talk about Abram. Chapter 11, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Genesis chapter 11. And we're going to talk about Abram. Now, notice that Abram's name is Ram. Ram. Ab means father. Ram means exalted. So exalted father is what Abram means. And the wife that has took, her name is Sarai. Sarai means my princess. Okay. And one of the things that I was trying to bring out before I was interrupted last week was that in Genesis chapter 11, we can plainly see that it was not Abram who came out of Ur of the Chaldees it was his father Terah that came out of the Ur of the Chaldees, and he brought his children with him. One of the things that I have to point out is that Canaan was the place where the Egyptian, Hittite, and Mesopotamian empires converged. And so you see a lot of mix. And even when you're reading the scriptures, you can see the mixes. You can see where you can see the Egyptian customs like circumcision and baptism. Those are Egyptian oriented customs. And you can see the Hittite customs. You can see the Syrian customs. And so you have to really examine. You should really look at Egyptian, Babylonian, Mesopotamian, and Hittite culture if you really want to understand what came from where. I'm not going to do that right now. But the point that I want to make is that when Abram and his father were migrating, they didn't migrate alone. There was a pattern. Um, the text, Genesis chapter 13, says that the Canaanites were then in the land. So that's a very important point. And the reason why that's important is because why does it feel the need to mention the Canaanites? The Canaanites were in the land when Abram got to the land. Or was it that Abram migrated with the Canaanites? It may have been both, because they came in, in droves. They didn't come all in one migration, but they had a migration pattern. And a lot of people wanted to move to Canaan, okay? And so it was Terah and not Abram who came out. This directly contradicts Genesis chapter 12, where it says that Yahweh spoke to Abram in Ur of the Chaldees and told him to leave the land of his ancestors. Genesis chapter 11 says that Terah was the one that left, while Genesis chapter 12 says that Abram was the one that left. Okay, there's a text also that I feel is worth mentioning. I don't remember where it is. Let me see if I can find it. The text should be in the prophets. Let's see. Go to Ezekiel chapter 16. Ezekiel chapter 16. Ezekiel chapter 16. And we're going to look at verse 3. It says, and say, thus says Yahweh, thus says Adonai Yahweh unto Jerusalem, thy birth and thy nativity is of the land of Canaan. Thy father was an Amorite, and thy mother a Hittite. What?
Well, weren't they Chaldeans?
Wait a minute. Whoa. Wait a minute. Stop. Again, your father is an Amorite. Who are the Amorites? And your mother was a Hittite. Who are the Hittites? They were Canaanites. Stop right there and just think about that for a minute. Think about it for a minute. Your father is an Amorite, and your mother is a Hittite. Not that your father is a Syrian, but your father is an Amorite, which would help us to explain how it was that Abram was able to make alliances with Hittites or Amorites.
Mm-hmm.
So Ezekiel chapter 16 and 3 says that Abram was an Amorite, and that that Sarai was a Hittite, which directly contradicts Genesis chapter 11. So the genealogies have no effect because later on in the text, they're contradicted. When you skip down to verse 45, that you are your mother's daughter that loathes her husband and her children, and you are the sister of your sisters, which loathe their husbands and their children. Your mother was a Hittite, and your father was an Amorite. So what's being said here?
Another version.
What's being said is that Sarai didn't like the Hittites, so she married an Amorite to get out of that culture. You are your mother's daughter who loathes her husband and her children, and you are the sister of your sisters. So why don't we hear? Why don't we hear much about Sarah? The Abrahamic faith pump up Abram as a father of nations and as a man of faith. But the same scriptures that they used to puff up Abram says this, that Abram was not a Shemite, he was an Amorite. So that means that the whole Genesis chapter 11 contradicts this story. Unless the Amorites were children of Shem and not children of Canaan. Okay, so we know that Genesis chapter 11 was not in the original text. Okay, first of all, because the Kenites would not have cared about Abram anyway. Why would they not have cared about Abram? Let me show you. Let's go into Genesis. We're going to go to Genesis chapter 12. Wait. You know what? Let's just skip to Genesis chapter 14. Genesis chapter 14. And we know what Genesis chapter 14 is. There's a big war from verses 1 all the way to verse 12. Abram gets involved, and Abram is called the Hebrew. Okay? Abram is called the Hebrew here. Who is Hebrew? He's the son of Eber. All right? Verse 13. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorites. So he was living with the Amorites, brother of Eshcol, the brother of Aner. And these were confederate with Abram. So Abram had a confederacy with the Amorites. He had a confederacy with the Amorites, which would only make sense if he was an Amorite. You mean to tell me that Mamre and Eshcol and Aner are all Amorites, and they just somehow, for some reason, we like Abram, we're going to make an alliance with a Hebrew? That doesn't seem to connect there. Abram must have been an Amorite, which was why he was allied with Amorites, because the Canaanites had the tendency to okay, let me clarify this, because even in my own mind, this is starting to go. The Canaanites, Canaan was just the land, okay? I don't think that my personal belief is that there was no physical person named Canaan, but the mix of tribes there in the land of Canaan became known as Canaanites. the people who lived in the land of Canaan. Okay, that's my personal belief, because when you look up the tribes that are named in Genesis chapter 10, um, it doesn't all make sense. You look at it in the Hebrew, and it doesn't all make sense. It doesn't make sense that they all were descendants of Canaan, but that they were a mix of tribes, yes, because the Hittites were a mix of tribes. The Amorites were a mix of tribes. They didn't come from a lineage. This and how do you know that? Science has proven that they were a mix of tribes and not a family that had descended from one person. And so Abram is allied with the Amorites for a reason. But then all of a sudden in verse 18, there's this guy named Melchizedek that comes out of nowhere. He's the king of Salem, and he brings bread and wine to Abram. Listen to this. And he was the priest of the Most High God. In the Hebrew, it says he was the priest of El Elyon. Okay? El Elyon. He was a priest of El Elyon. You already know where I'm going with this. El Elyon is a title for El. El is the actual name. Elyon means Most High, because El was the father of the God, so he was the Most High in that religion. And so Melchizedek is a priest of El, okay? And he worships him under the title of El Elyon. Verse 19, Melchizedek blesses Abram and says, "Blessed be Abram of El Elyon." So Abram is receiving a blessing from the priest of El. And what does Abram do? He gives his tithe to Melchizedek, this priest of El. What does this mean? That it is impossible for Abram to be a worshiper of Yahweh and to be a worshiper of El. Well, it's not impossible. Let me correct myself.
Both of them?
Mm-hmm. But Abram didn't know who Yahweh was. Okay? Abram did not know who Yahweh was, because how would Yahweh have been revealed to him? It's kind of impossible, because there is no until he gets to the Kenites, then that's when you might see that that Abram learned of Yahweh. Okay, there's something to that too. So what we have to notice, and this is going to blow everybody away, is that, again, starting from the beginning, that El, it does not mean God. El was an actual name in those times, in those ages. Okay, El was the name of the father of all of the gods in the Canaanite pantheon. And if they are a mix of tribes, you can understand why they would have a pantheon of gods, because the Canaanites were a mix of tribes. So these gods are coming from different tribes. Okay, they have a pantheon, which means they have a list of gods that they know are worshipped in Canaan. El is the father of these gods. Okay, in their mythology, in their pantheon. Yahweh was not originally from that pantheon. The Kenites were separate. Their creation story is separate. Everything about the Kenites is different from El. But the following customs that I'm going to name to you have to do with El worship: the tithe, the sacrifices, and the tabernacle. All of those are from El worship. How do you know that? This is pure blasphemy, brother. Well, there were found in a city in Iraq called Ugarit. Ugarit, they found tablets that of the word that described the worship of El and the worship of Baal. And so they noticed the sacrifices, they noticed the tithe, they noticed the tabernacle in that worship. Okay?
Both
Look it
of
up.
them.
Huh?
Both of them.
No, just El.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. And so we'll talk about how all of these things came to be placed in the Bible in some near future. But what's plainly established here in Genesis 14 is that Abram doesn't worship Yahweh. He worships El. Okay? He is a worshiper of El. Because if a priest from another religion came to me and they said, I want to, first of all, a priest from another religion would not come to me. Yeah. That's something we have to understand. If a priest comes to you for a certain reason to bless you, priests don't bless people outside of their religion. That's one thing to notice. And this is not something new. This is not modern. This is not, oh, this is just how you think. No, this is the way things are. A priest would not go to someone outside of their religion and bless them. Neither would I give money or donation to a priest that is not of my religion. If they come to me and they say, oh, they give me some advice, okay, thank you. But I wouldn't give them a donation. But Abram gives his tithe. And so this to me is evidence that Abram was a worshiper of El. Abram was a worshiper of El, but Abram is also an Amorite, which helps us to understand why he's worshiping El. He's an Amorite. If Sarai worshipped El, it will be understandable also, but she's a Hittite. Okay? So, okay, that may not be sufficient enough. But in Genesis chapter 15, it says that Yahweh promised Abram that he would be a father of nations and that he would possess certain lands. Now, El is also known as the father of progeny, meaning he's the one that promises to give you children. That's what El does, okay? And so it may not have been Yahweh doing all of this in Genesis chapter 15. But if you notice, I want you to go down Genesis chapter 15 and verse 8. It says, in the same day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed shall I give this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. That's practically the whole land of Canaan. The whole land, okay? It says the Kenites, the first group mentioned is the Kenites. So the Kenites were there.
What chapter?
Genesis chapter 15.
Okay.
The Kenites are the first group mentioned. Why would Yahweh give Abram the land of the Kenites?
The land of the righteous.
They're the ones that are worshiping Yahweh. They're the ones that are worshiping Yahweh. So how is it that Yahweh is going to give their land away to someone else? Abram was not worshiping Yahweh. It will make sense if El said, because El is the one that gives inheritances. Hello. Oh, brother, what are you talking about? Let me take you to Deuteronomy. Let's see. I think it's Deuteronomy. I found it. Or maybe I didn't. Yes, I did find it. Deuteronomy chapter 32. Okay, Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8. It says, when the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance. When he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. So, verse 8 says, when the Most High, that word in Hebrew is Elyon. Elyon. Look up Elyon. Look up Elyon. And you see that it's tied to El. Okay? So Elyon is the one who divides the nations for their inheritance. The ancients believed that each god received a nation. So you had the Philistines worshipped Dagon, and the Edomites worshipped Molech, and the Ammonites worshipped a different god, and that god was the god of that nation who had received that nation as an inheritance. Okay, so understand that even the Bible is telling us in Hebrew and in Deuteronomy chapter 32 that Elyon, speaking of El, is the one who divides inheritances. Verse 9, for the portion of Yahweh is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. So eventually they begin to believe that Yahweh was a child of El. Remember, hold on. Remember this. Remember that these are a bunch of nations crammed into one land. And so they had to have a way, an explanation for why these different gods were worshipped. And their explanation was that, oh, Yahweh is a child of El. Okay. Later on in history, Yahweh and Baal would begin to contend with each other. Okay. So, and then there's a story behind that. And so, but the point I want to make is that El Elyon is the one that gave inheritances. So when we go back to Genesis chapter 15, we should understand that Yahweh is not the one that talks about inheritances. Even in whatever tradition they had, Yahweh was not the one that gave inheritances. El Elyon was the one that gave inheritances. So the first land of inheritance that this God wants to mention is the Kenites. We want to get rid of the Kenites. So the theme is, if Abram was going to inherit that land, then he had to get rid of the people that were there. So if the Kenites were worshiping Yahweh, would Yahweh want to get rid of the people that are actually worshiping him and give it to somebody who's not worshiping him? Of course not. So that means that Yahweh was not the one that made these pronunciations. Okay? But they're using that as an explanation of why Abram got inherited those lands. Okay? Genesis chapter 16 talks about the birth of Ishmael. Not Ishmael, Ishmael. Ishmael. He has El at the end of his name. Ishmael.
Abraham rejected Abimelech's gifts, right?
I don't think so. He didn't reject
the sheep and the stuff.
No.
No. Oh.
Mm-mm.
But he took the maid.
Well, supposedly, Hagar was an Egyptian. So that story where Abram goes into Egypt, he scares the pants off of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh kicks him out of Egypt and sends him with a bunch of gifts. One of those gifts was Hagar.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So Hagar is an Egyptian, and she is a concubine of Abram. And Abram, we got to walk through this, y'all. Let's walk through this.
But why would Pharaoh, somebody who's very high, give Abraham a maid unless they have a pact.
That's also a thing to think about. Abram must have been a person with a big um yeah, I know. El, the god of childbirth, prosperity, sacrifices. Sounds like El worship took over the Bible, and it did. El worship did take care of the Bible because El worship. They think that the El tradition was the smallest one.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually the largest one.
Yeah.
But why would Abram? Why would the Pharaoh give Abram gifts like servants and maids, unless he was already a rich man and a well-known man? Okay, so Abram was a well-known, exalted father, is what his name means. Abram, Abram, exalted father. So he was known. He was known before he came to Canaan. Okay, or he was known. He may have already been in Canaan. There is a theory that the Israelites were not a separate tribe, but that they grew out of the Canaanites. And that seems to make sense because even Ezekiel says that Abram was an Amorite.
That's interesting. They said that they found in Israel, supposedly Yahweh and Asherah were.
He had a
those
consort.
were the gods of the Israelites, but they were found in Canaan. Canaanites.
But we're going to talk about all of that in a minute. Andre says sacrilege. So, Pharaoh, for some odd reason, they try to say that, it was because Sarah, Abram, when he said that Sarah was his sister, and so Yahweh told the Pharaoh to stay away from Sarah, and it caused a big issue, and so Pharaoh sent Abram out. Yeah, that doesn't seem that logical. Oh yeah, just say you're my sister. Okay. Moving on. So, but anyway, Sarai, Sarai, let me say it like that, Sarai, she came to possess Hagar. Now, in a bunch of places it says that Sarai was barren. Mm-hmm. And so we, looking in Western culture, feel like it's pretty weird that Sarai is saying, "Oh, I can't have a child. Take my maid." Yeah, that doesn't happen these days. That's very weird.
Javi said before Moses, all the nations worshipped El.
Before Moses, all the nations worshipped El. Yes, except the Kenites. All the nations worshipped El because El was the father of all of the Canaanite gods. He was it was the highest god of the Canaanite list of gods. And so, what was I saying? But it was very commonplace because marriage was a bit different back in those days. And if you'll give me a little bit of time, I'll explain it to you. So when it came to marriage, obviously men had a lot of power, but a woman was given her worth by her fertility. And it seems like, it sounds like, oh man, these men were using, these women. But the whole purpose was to have children. These people possessed land, and they needed to defend the land, and they needed to work the land. And the best way to do it, there's a parable of Yeshua where he says that, when he talks about a man who owned land and he hired workers, and the workers took over his land. Okay. And so that was always a threat. And so it would be better to have children. And so children were free labor that they didn't have to pay. And so it was best to have children to work your land. And then once they grew up, they could also protect you, or they could protect the land. And so that was a pretty common interest. Well, if a woman couldn't bear children, the man could just move on. And so a woman could easily get tossed to the side if she couldn't have children. And so the security, what you will see is when we talk about Jacob, what they would do was they would give their, with the daughters, they would give a maid. And the maid, the purpose of that maid was just in case the woman couldn't give birth or she couldn't give birth to enough children, that maid would step in and she would become a surrogate. That was the whole purpose of the maid, okay? Not just to attend to the wife, but also for childbirth. Okay, and so this is why men had many wives and many concubines, because usually he had only one wife, but he would have concubines, as in servant women. It wasn't until David we see David having many wives, and Solomon having many wives and concubines. So Solomon married princesses. So of course they had maids, and those maids served that purpose of giving him many children. We don't know how many children he had. He had a whole bunch of wives. So this is a cultural thing, and how this was found out was, first of all, from the Law of Hammurabi that was found, and also there was a tablet found in Turkey. I forget the name of the tablet, but it was a marriage covenant that was written. And the marriage covenant specifically says that if the woman could not have a child, a male child, within 3 years, the man was able to go and get another wife. So back then they didn't divorce, but if the woman was barren, she was barren. So the first wife might be the love wife, the wife, of love. But the other ones afterwards were, more or less for childbirth. And again, it sounds bad because it feels like women are being used. But that was a different time. And so Sarah gives Hagar to Abram as a wife. So notice, verse 2, Genesis 16:2. And Sarai said unto Abram, behold, now Yahweh has restrained me from bearing. I pray, or please, go into my maid. So it was her suggestion and not his. He didn't say, you know what, you're not having children, so why don't I just, get with the maid? No, because Sarah understood, I'm getting older, I haven't given him any children. He can put me away, he can divorce me, or he can find another wife. And so in order to secure her position, she gave her maid so that the maid could bear children. Now, here's the interesting thing. Hagar becomes very haughty, and there is a kind of well, I guess that part doesn't come out. It says in verse 15, chapter 16, verse 15, it says, and Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bore, Ishmael. Why would he name his son after El if he was worshiping Yahweh? He named him Ishmael. He named him Ishmael. Okay? That's another evidence that Abram was not a worshiper of Yahweh. He must have been a worshiper of El. We keep going. Genesis chapter 16. And when verse 1, and Abram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am El Shaddai. Very significant. We're going to skip that part. We're going to skip chapter 18 and 19. We're going to get there, you guys. I'll explain those chapters later. But now's not the time. We're talking about the book of Yahweh. And so I believe that the book of Yahweh kind of skips over the patriarchs because Abram, first of all, was a worshiper of El. Okay? And so something else that's significant is in Genesis chapter 21. And I just want to establish, because I didn't say this, that starting from chapter 14, Genesis chapter 14, that is where the El tradition starts off. It doesn't give a genealogy for Abram. Okay? No genealogy for Abram. It just starts off that Abram ended up in the land of Canaan with the Amorites. Okay. So Sarai gives birth to Isaac, and she says, "You know what? We don't need this maidservant anymore. We don't need this maidservant and her child. Just put her away." And so Abram puts the child away. Starting at Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. And Abram rose up early in the morning, took bread and a bottle of water, and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder and the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Interesting thing. How did Abram put his wife away? He put her away with nothing. Absolutely nothing. He didn't even. Her? Well, yeah, he married her.
It's his wife, but it says first the maid, so I don't see anywhere where it transition.
So that transition came along when he went into her. Okay. So marriage was not a formal thing back then. Mm-hmm. And especially when it came to concubines, because they were servants. Okay. So there wasn't a big wedding, like we're going to see with Jacob. There were weddings for his wives, okay, but there was no wedding for the concubine. So let's see. And so Abram sends his wife away with nothing. Zero. Zilch. Nothing but a bottle of water and a child. And sent them into the wilderness. He didn't apportion a place for them to live. He just sent them away. That's pretty harsh right there. That is really harsh. He just sent her away with nothing. Didn't give her a place to live. Just said, here's your child. Here's some water. Go ahead and walk around and see where you end up.
Doesn't sound like, servant of Yahweh.
Doesn't sound like a servant of Yahweh, does it? Okay, so that was pretty cruel. I just gotta say that. Verse 15, and the water was spent in the bottle, and she cast the child under one of the shrubs, and she went and sat herself down over against him, meaning she was sitting opposite of him, looking at him, as it were a bow shot. She was away off, as it were a bow shot, and she said, "Let me not see the death of this child." And she sat over against him and lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad. And the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said unto her, "What is wrong with thee? What is wrong with you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the child where he is." So the child was crying also. "Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thy hand, for I will make him a great nation. So El promises to make Ishmael a great nation. El is where Islam comes from. Hello. El is where Judaism comes from.
Christianity.
Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Okay.
So Abraham, the father of all religions, basically.
It was just a glorified worship of El. Craziness, right? Okay. So remember from chapter 14, most of the book of Genesis is all the is mostly the El tradition and the priestly tradition exchanging stories. Okay, and so that's worth thinking about. Okay, now when we're looking at Isaac, there's nothing really impressive about Isaac. Isaac, he just sits in his place and he just goes about his business.
Well, that's the weird part. It's like Abraham a lot.
Abraham is big, Isaac is small. Jacob is big again.
Yeah.
Or medium size, maybe medium size. But when we go back, let's go to Genesis chapter 28. Genesis chapter 28 and verse 1. It says, And Isaac called Jacob and blessed him, and charged him and said unto him, You should not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Now, this seems to be a pattern. They seem to not like the Canaanites. Mm-hmm. Okay? And that's because the Deuteronomy tradition stuck those texts in there where they didn't like the Canaanites. The Deuteronomy people, they're Yahweh alone. They wanted to separate themselves away from the Canaanites who were worshiping El. Okay? So, verse 2, Arise, go to Banadaram, to the house of Bethuel, note that, your mother's father, and take a wife from there of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. And El Shaddai bless you. Wait a minute. Abram was blessed by El Elyon, and now Isaac is blessing Jacob in the name of El Shaddai. What do they have in common? El. El Shaddai was a title. Shaddai is a title for El. It basically means God of the mountain.
Canaanites come from where?
The Canaanites are a combination of tribes, so you can't really track where they come from. They're just a bunch of people that's coming from different places. Remember that that Canaan is just the name of the land. The people and the name and the land were called Canaanites because they lived there, not because they descended from a person like Abram. All the nations that come from Abram, but they were a mix of Egyptian, Hittite, Mesopotamian, and probably Babylonian. Okay. What does Matthias have to say? Do you think El was worshipped in the first temple? I ask because it is known that a female representation was worshipped in the Hebraic temple of Elephantine.
I wonder if it's Asherah.
So Asherah, that would have been Asherah. Yes. And the reason why is I've told you guys about the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis says that there were different versions. There was a Yahweh version, there was the El version, but there was a point where the Yahweh version and the El version were combined. They call it the JE version. Now, when you look at for instance, the book of Psalms, the Proverbs, Ecclesiastics, those are the products of the JE the JE theory. Now, the JE, most of those texts, if you don't know, had to have been compiled by Hezekiah or by one of Hezekiah's sons. Hezekiah has Proverbs in the book of Proverbs. Okay, and so Hezekiah came around the time where the northern tribes were already exiled, and many of them were starting to integrate into the southern tribe. They needed a place to stay. So what better way to do that than to integrate Yahweh and El? So it had to have happened in his time. Okay. And so when they're talking about the temple, they're talking about Davidic worship, and Davidic Yahwehism is different from Kenite Yahwehism. Kenite Yahwehism doesn't need a temple. Where does the temple come from?
Or priests.
Nor does it need priests. Where does the temple come from? The temple, the idea of the tabernacle and the temple comes from the El worship. It might be Egyptian and it might be Babylonian. The Egyptians had a lot of temples. But the Kenites didn't have temples. They didn't have temples, okay? And so, yes, that the first temple was worshiping El.
Okay,
Essentially.
how can they worship Kenites?
The Kenites, they probably worshipped as families. They probably had cities of refuge where they would just come together and do feasts. There's no definitive way for me to define what the Kenites were doing, but I don't have that much research on the Kenites because they're very absent. You don't know that much about them.
That is the truth.
Right, yeah, the truth is always the most hidden thing. And so I do believe that El was worshipped, and El had a wife. And so there came a time when the J and the E version were being combined, that everything about El became everything about Yahweh. And so El basically makes a transition. So El is the Most High, and Yahweh had to be elevated. Okay, he had to be elevated in status, and so instead of just trying to elevate him in status, it just merged Yahweh with El. And so you see a lot of texts that say Yahweh El, Yahweh Elohim, because just so that merge could happen. Okay, and so this is why there was a discovery recently of Yahweh with a consort who was Asherah.
Yeah.
And so that's the reason why it's like that.
Supposedly in the Israelite religion,
that's called Israelite Yahwehism. Okay. So in Israelite Yahwehism, that's where that comes from. The JE version is that Israelite Yahwehism that combined El and Yahweh together. And so Yahweh becomes the Most High God. All the other gods are below him. Later, after that, comes the Yahweh alone movement, that they begin to preach, there is no other, we shouldn't be worshiping all of these other gods. We should only be worshiping Yahweh. Okay? So by that time, Yahweh had been elevated.
This all stuff explains difficult step by step, right?
It gets, yeah. And so, like, when you can see when you're separating the traditions, and I'm trying to come out with that, you guys. I'm trying to finish it. I'm almost done with it. I've been saying that for a long time. But yeah, I'm trying to finish it. Where you can see the progression in the traditions, you can see the progression and things that are happening. And so when the J version and the E version are combined, you get Israelite Yahwehism. And that's basically what it was from the beginning. The Israelites were very integrated with the Canaanites. And there came a time when the Israelites wanted to become more powerful. They wanted to outdo the Canaanites. And that probably happened around the time of David, when David came and he became a mighty warrior, and he was subduing nations, and the kingdom became so big. Okay. And so that's the only explanation that it can be, that's called Israelite Yahwehism. What have I been calling Levitical Yahwehism? Because Levitical Yahwehism, when it was a mix of El and Yahweh. Okay, so there seems to be an era in Israelite history where they were trying to integrate Yahweh and El. And when you look in the scriptures, you have people like Samuel, who is worshiping Yahweh. So that means it didn't start in David's time. It started a little bit before David's time. Okay. And so you see that pattern from the book of Judges. You don't see that many El names in the book of Judges.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get to Samuel, you start to see El a lot. Okay. So there was something happened in that era where, you know, either Yahweh was forgotten, or because Abi, whenever you see the Abi, there's an Abimelech there. Whenever you see Abi, that has to do with Yahweh. No, it doesn't. It has to do with El.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. It has to do with El. Okay. And so they were transitioning from from El worship to the worship of Yahweh, who is also El.
So they called El Father.
Mm-hmm. Because he was the father of the gods.
So your name means Mephibosheth.
No, I changed that a long time ago.
So he said something interesting. It has me thinking. Matthias.
Mm-hmm.
He said that El was worshiping the first temple. Is that when, I don't know which book it was. I don't know if it was Ezekiel, but they started the worship of the angels of the zodiac.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty much Catholicism, all in there. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So El was worshipped in the first temple.
So can it be said that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were Trinitarians? The worship of El, Baal, and Asherah?
Not Trinitarians.
Okay.
They were polytheists.
Okay. Because more gods.
There were more gods.
Okay.
Yeah. There were more gods. So they were polytheists. But what we see here, okay, we see Abraham being blessed in the name of El, giving tithes to El. We see Isaac, who is blessing his son in the name of El. And let's keep going. Let's go. We can go later on in that same chapter. Genesis chapter 28 and verse 13. I'm almost done, you guys. I just want to prove the point. I want us to see the scriptures where the patriarchs are worshiping El. Okay. Starting at Genesis chapter 28 and verse 13. It says, and behold, Yahweh stood above it and said, I am Yahweh, God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. And the land, wait a minute, go back there. What does that say? I am the father of I am Yahweh, God of Abram, your father. I am the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. You see how Isaac is not given that much importance?
Yeah.
Where Abraham is stressed as your father?
Mm-hmm.
Something tells you that the genealogies might be off. Okay. The land where you are lying, I will give it to you and to your seed, to your children. Okay, so who's speaking? According to the text, Yahweh is speaking, right?
Yeah.
Verse 18. And Jacob rose up early in the morning and took the stone that he had put for his pillows and set it up for a pillar and poured oil upon the top of it. And he named the name of the place Beth El. If Yahweh is talking to him, why is the name of the place Bethel?
Is it the same as Bethuel?
Bethuel is different.
Okay.
Okay. So why is the name of the place Beth-El? That Beth-El is proof that that Jacob was a worshiper of El. He's saying, "Oh my goodness, this is the house of God. I'm gonna name the place where I saw Yahweh after El." Doesn't make sense. Okay. So we can skip. Not only that, but Jacob is called Israel, not Israel, Israel, Israel,
So
not
all the
Israel.
Israelites, so they worship here.
The Israelites were originally worshippers of El.
So when is the Moses came and celebrated?
And that's what we're going to be talking about next week. We're going to be talking about Moses, and uh, the we're going to be talking about Moses and where the Israelites began to worship Yahweh. But we're going to be talking about it from a historical perspective, not from a biblical perspective, but from a historical perspective. Okay. So I pray that this was a blessing to all of you. I thank you all for coming. We had like 5 people at one time.
Yeah.
So praise Yahweh for that. I pray that you all are blessed with everything. Okay. So Yahweh be with you. Shabbat shalom. I usually don't say Shabbat shalom. I say blessings on the Shabbat. And I'll be seeing you. I'll be seeing you next week. I don't want us to forget though that next week is Shavuot. And Shavuot, we will be meeting in convention. We will be meeting in assembly. We'll talk about how we're going to get all of it done. We're going to work all of this stuff out. And it'll be announced to everybody so that everybody can take part. I'm not going to do that here. But I'll be seeing you guys probably next week sometime, okay? You all be blessed. Enjoy your week.
Yahweh bless.
Yahweh be with you.
Hallelujah.
It's good stuff today. It's good.